Hey everyone, today on Amaranth Bay, we're going to continue the port by building the big public terminal that sits on the end of the peninsula. This video will focus on the various dockside operations, like the intermodal container area, and then of course next episode we'll move on to the interior area. For the key, I'm going to copy and paste the ones that I built last episode for the expansion dock, and use those kind of as like modules to fill in the whole length of the dock. We'll be adding a bunch of variation to the surfaces here later, but for now I just wanted to get something plopped down so that we could get everything oriented and spaced out correctly relative to the kind of geography of the dock. Although I do have to come in right now and clean up some of the edges and corners just so I don't have to worry about that later, or even worse, forget about it. For inspiration today, we will be looking at Duluth's public marine terminal. I wanted to follow the general logic of the layout fairly closely while still leaving some flexibility so that later on we can move some things around when we get to actually building each part of the terminal. I started by putting down some temporary assets just to block out the spacing, and then added in the main straight sections of track where that is needed, since that's going to determine where most of the roads and of course the curves in the track will go. I did the same thing with the road, and then connected up all the straight sections with some nice sweeping curves to form a loop for both the rail and the road, and we'll have some spurs and various things like that coming off of these in order to access all the different facilities. Just like with the Duluth dock, I wanted to provide rail access to a number of areas, one of them being these distribution center buildings over here. So I'm going to add a long spur in there, and then also a shorter one along the dock, and these are each going to give access to different things. Then I'm going to add in a highly temporary rail yard over here just to get a sense of the placement and the amount of space it's going to take up. I figured I'd mention that I do really struggle to get these connections to look good, so I think I'm going to have to go look up a tutorial or just mess around with it a bunch to try to get something that looks good when we come back and build this in more detail in a future video, because we're not going to get to it today. I was a little concerned about the angle of the main avenue here after it passes by the interchange, so what I decided to try here was shifting the intersection over a bit to be in line with the loop road. And I think that the resulting change in the curve makes it look like it's kind of more going from A to B intentionally, whereas before it just felt like an arbitrary curve in the road. Anyway, we have our main streetcar line that runs along the entirety of that avenue, and that's going to terminate at this small length of road for reasons that will become clear in a future episode. Going back to those other spurs that I was talking about, I'm basically going to copy the ones from Duluth because they just look really cool how they kind of arc in here and then split up to access the different facilities in the interior. For the loop road, I'm going to upgrade it into this plain pavement road, which is going to give us lots of flexibility for detailing. And also it has no sidewalk, which I think makes the most sense given that this is a heavy industrial area. Here's a quick rundown of my plan for the layout of the public terminal. Starting at the top right, we have the heavy lift dock, where we'll be shipping out wind turbine parts and possibly giant Pingu statues. Moving clockwise, we encounter a set of warehouses centered around this rail spur, which will handle whatever kind of goods they can cram into a boxcar, I guess. Next to this is a small depot for fueling ships. And for this long length of dock, we'll deviate from Duluth a bit and have a container yard for dry goods, along with a bit of reefer. Reefer, of course, referring to refrigeration in this case. Finally, over here, we'll have a general cargo or break bulk dock to handle everything else. In the interior area, I have absolutely no idea, like I said, so I'll get back to you on that one next episode. We're going to start off with the heavy lift dock, which I'm going to have basically be in the process of loading a ship with wind turbine blades. I think those are called blades, I guess. Apparently docks like this are like reinforced for heavier loads and have like a specific type of crane that can handle that sort of load. So I wanted to evoke that a little bit with these details. For the cranes, I'm using this prop, which is apparently just a crane that someone ripped from one of the Vanilla Harbor buildings and uploaded to the workshop, but I think it actually is the closest looking one I could find to the two big cranes in Duluth, and they look pretty good. These run on tracks, so I'm using IMT to add in the rails on either side, and while I'm at it, I'm also going to add in a decal filler and give the dock a unique appearance compared to the rest of the facility. I needed it to be a bit wider than the rail network that I was building it off of, so I have to offset all the nodes and then just shift the rail decals in a bit so that everything is lined up. I figured the best way to add in the wind turbine blades was to use a wind turbine, weirdly enough. It's a bit annoying to have to merge all these nodes together in PO and make the rest of it disappear, but luckily I only have to do it once and then I can just copy and paste it as many times as I need. Apparently, these things are usually shipped by placing them into these stackable frames, which kind of makes sense. So to stand in for those, I'm using these oil pipeline support props because it's really kind of the only boxy frame-like thing that I had in my collection. I believe I read somewhere that these things are usually trucked in rather than being brought in by rail. So even though we already have some staged here on the dock, I thought it would be interesting to have at least one that is being brought in by truck currently. So I'm going to make that using this set of heavy cargo truck props. Although I initially made this whole setup way too long, so I realized I had to come back and compress it a bit by pulling in the rear frame piece and the rear wheels. As cool as all these parts are, I thought that it needed a little bit more pizzazz, so I thought it would be fun to have these cranes moving along the rails. It was actually pretty easy to do with the back and forth module in PO, just adjusting the time that it takes for each one to complete its circuit, because they have to move different distances, so to be moving at the same speed, you want them to take different amounts of time to do that. Finally, we have the missing piece, which is the ship that's being loaded with these things, which I just turned into a PO and turned blue for some reason, but I think it looks cool. And then I put a few of these blades on top of that. Next door to the heavy lift dock will be the rail-focused warehouses. I'm going to use this classic set of distribution centers by Avanya, which is nice because it comes with this functional cargo station version. I do have to fiddle around a little bit with node controller and move it to make the connections between the normal rail and the station track look straight, but I think in the end it looks okay, especially once we come back and cover up the station track with some pavement props to match the rest of the spur. I'm going to have some dummy buildings on the other side of the track because I could already foresee the ridiculous amount of traffic that the functional one is going to generate, and I didn't want to exacerbate that problem. So I'm going to turn these into POs, which is also going to be handy for detailing, as you'll see in a moment. But first, I wanted to add in these little awning things that you see in the Duluth reference, which I guess is just to cover the working area along the platform. But I didn't really have a fitting asset for it, so I ended up just using this metal awning, which maybe looks a little bit too rusty given the context. But I think it looks kind of like an intentional pattern from a distance after being shrunk down to this size, so I'm not too worried about the kind of worn down look. And I think overall it adds just a more unique silhouette to the building that you don't get from something that is literally just a rectangular prism. Even though we're not going to have any functional traffic coming out of the rest of the buildings, I did want to detail up the facades to make it look like there could be some activity going on. So I love a flat gray building as much as the next guy, but I think that one thing that's interesting about the reference buildings is that they're a nice shade of blue. So I think that much like changing the awnings, changing the color of the buildings is going to make them stand out that little extra bit and just make the port look more interesting overall. It's pretty easy to do this for the dummy buildings because I can just add in a color rectangle over the wall texture area of the texture. But for the functional building, I obviously can't just turn it into a PO. So I have to make a copy of it, then turn that copy into a PO, and then add in the same color rectangle. And then because it's the same size as the functional building, of course, I have to size it up just a little bit so that it covers up all the facades. So with all that done, I thought that the dockside area looked a little bit barren, so I'm going to have to add some of my favorite stain decals in here, which is always fun, and then line up some random crap along the wall, just like in real life. You might be surprised to know that I have absolutely no idea how ship fueling works, so I chose to more or less copy the facility in Duluth. From the satellite view, some of the bits here seem to have a nice blue tinge, kind of like the warehouses, but a little more subtle. So I'm going to have that here as well with this kit bash building, which I'm going to put together out of a couple of different industrial things. I also thought that the roof on this building looked a little bit grimy given the context, so I'm going to replace it with this roof network. The equivalent area in Duluth has a significantly different texture here on the corner of the dock. I'm not sure what the exact material is in real life, whether it's like asphalt or concrete or what, but I thought that it would be cool to have it be metal here for some reason. So I took these barges, PO'd them to get them into these little modular pieces, and then I just filled in the available space. And I also mirrored a couple of them so that the texture doesn't look too repetitive. Behind the building are some tanks, which I'm going to go out on a limb and assert are where the fuel is stored. So there are only 4 of these in Duluth, and I felt like one-upping them a little bit, so I'm going to put down a 6-pack. I haven't really been able to find a good metal tank asset on the workshop that would fit into this context, so I had to use these concrete silos. I assume that concrete wouldn't be great for storing liquid, but like I said, I also have no idea how any of this works, so I could be wrong. I could be wrong about all of this, I guess. I hope I'm not. Anyway, I think they look okay from a distance. In Duluth, the left-hand part of the building looks like it might be where trucks pull in, maybe to deliver fuel. That would make sense, I think. But I wanted to have a fuel delivery area on the outside, out in the open for everyone to see. And also because I wanted something to fill up this paved area. So I'm going to put some pumps here, although now that I'm thinking about it, I feel like fuel is actually just like sucked out of the trucks into like a area in the ground. At least that's what it looks like when I've seen trucks delivering fuel at gas stations. So maybe it's not the most realistic thing, but that's fine. Anyway, there's a turnaround and a parking area here with a bit of a worn down surface using all the usual decals, and the surface under the tanks is going to get a similar blue tinge to the building, just like you see in the satellite imagery. Very last thing, I'm going to yoink one of these marine arms from the bulk dock from last episode and turn it yellow. There is a blobby yellow thing visible in the satellite imagery in Duluth. I think it might actually be a crane to like hold pipes coming out of the ships or something, but I think it's more cool to have it be a marine arm. Apparently, there's actually not much container shipping done in the Great Lakes region. Duluth, along with Cleveland, are apparently the 2 ports that do have more substantial container capabilities, so I wanted to take that idea and pump it up just a little bit. We're going to do that by dedicating most of this main stretch of dock to container operations. It's not going to look like the typical seaport that is so fun to build in this game, with like row after row of these 40-foot container stacks, but I do think it's going to add a nice bit of color and texture to the build from a distance. I'm going to lay down a little loop road first using this asphalt road, and I'm also going to make the tracks look like they're embedded in the pavement using asphalt props in IMT. That way, when we come back in the detailing phase to blend everything together, it'll look like a single continuous surface. Moving over here to make the main 40-foot container stack, I'm going to use these pre-built ones to form the base. It's sort of like if you ever built your own like Lego castle or whatever. You'd use all your like red and yellow bricks on the inside as supports, and then you'd cover it up with all your gray pieces or whatever other exciting color you wanted to use. In this case, the pre-built stacks are just going to give some volume underneath the ones that I'm hand placing. And the reason for this is that it seems like you tend to have different brands and colors of containers more or less clustered together. I don't know if this is just because ships tend to carry one or like a few types of containers, and that's just how they come into the port, or if there's some other reason for this, but I think that it looks more realistic to do it this way. It would almost look kind of too random to have them scattered about like they are in the default stacks. It is a bit more time consuming to do it this way though, so there is that. Nearby, there is going to be a similar but smaller stack of 20-foot containers, and not just smaller because the containers are smaller because they seem to be less common in general. This isn't the full extent of container staging and storage in the port, as we're going to add some secondary storage areas later on, and we also had the empty storage from last episode on the expansion dock, but this is the extent of the central container yard. There is a little bit more space over here though, so next door we are going to have the reefer building, which slots in nicely into this area, I think. Although it is just a tiny bit too big, so I sized it down using PO and replaced the functionality using a warehouse block. Speaking of functionality, I wanted to get the container yard set up to be functional for not just ship and truck, but also for rail, so we can have a really intermodal looking place. So I'm going to use this blank cargo terminal set to use this container train, and I'm going to connect the station track up to the main loop. I'm also going to clip a warehouse block into the container stack and only allow container trucks to spawn. It's probably unnecessary given the obscene amounts of trucks that will soon be spawning out of the rail station when deliveries are made, but I couldn't resist the idea of having cargo accumulating within the confines of the container stack itself. Finally, for the ship, I'm going to use a blank cargo dock clipped into the dock, and while I was thinking of it, I added some containers to the working area as well, so when there isn't a ship moored here, you can imagine that they are preparing to load up an incoming vessel, or you could imagine that they just unloaded one. So all of that stuff is nice in theory, but as you might expect, there's a lot of silliness that goes on when you make a custom setup like this. The first big problem is that the train I was using was a little bit too long. That fix was pretty easy, as I just used the random train trailers mod to change the number of trailers that can be spawned. So even though the asset I'm using comes as a 24-car train, I can limit it to less than that. I can actually limit it to a range, which is really cool. The next problem is that trains would get stuck, which I think is because they would want to leave, but then the next incoming train would block their path because we don't really have a rail path heading out of here over to the Wisconsin side of things. So both trains would just sit there and wait for the other one to go, which is a really great way to operate a port. No, it isn't. My solution to that is to delete the trains when I see this happening, which is not the most elegant solution ever, but it is actually quite entertaining to do. So that's how we're going to do it for now, and maybe I'll try to troubleshoot it more in the future. Finally, I was a little bit worried that I didn't see any ships coming. Eventually, I realized that you can actually monitor outside connection traffic using the Transfer Manager mod. So using that, I confirmed that there were some ships queuing and that I just needed to wait a while, and eventually they did come, which is cool. So as you can see here, I fixed all the problems and everything is now working perfectly. One thing I forgot to talk about was the cranes. So often at big ports, you'll get these huge ship-to-shore cranes. I'm sure you know the ones I'm talking about, but I'm thinking that those are not really warranted at a smaller port like this, even with the higher level of container volume that I want to have going on here. So I took inspiration from Cleveland, where they have these big mobile cranes, and I couldn't really find one on the workshop that fit, so I decided to build my own with a bit of kit bashing. I used this big tower crane for the main portion of the crane, and then used a few of these little wheeled gantry things to make the wheelie bit. And then finally just added in some feet using, wow, I just said feet. Anyway, to build the feet, I used a piece from that same heavy load truck set and just mashed it up a bit with PO. These cranes seem to have attachments for when they're used for moving containers, which kind of makes sense because a hook wouldn't really do much for a container. So I'm just going to yoink one from this reach stacker prop and clip it in at the end of the dangly bit. So with all the key aspects of the container yard done, it's time to speed things up a bit with some clutter and surfaces and various other doodads. There was also this awkward grassy bit left, which I'm going to turn into a random storage area, kind of like the equivalent spot in Duluth, except mine is going to be a bit more on the junkyard end of the spectrum than the real life one, which is a bit more organized. Sort of like with the heavy lift dock earlier, I wanted the wharf surface of the container yard to be different from the rest of the port to indicate that there's a different usage and also just to make it visually stand out. And I think that'll help draw the eye, much like the colorful containers in the stacks. For this, I'm going to use this nice concrete decal, put a few of them down in IMT, and make the color a little bit warmer just to help it stand out, like I said. So I've kind of brushed over the stain and wear decals that I've been using so far, and that's because I wanted to save any rambling I had for them until now, when we're going to put down like 10 million of them about, so I figured this would be a better time to talk about them. So I use these wear decals basically to follow the main paths that trucks are going to take through the yard. So basically just going along the main loop road and then a couple of smaller routes as well. Around the containers, I'm going to use these container wear decals. I didn't want to do the fancy painted lines like you see at the big seaport container yards because I just thought that would be a bit too much. The rest of the surface is going to be positively pelted with a variety of stain decals, which I tried to mix up by alternating them, changing the sizes of some of them, and changing their brightness just to get a wider variety of textures and maybe hint at the different zones that are being used, different amounts and for different purposes. Oh, and one more thing before we move on. I'm going to animate this reach stacker using PO, using the same back and forth module as before, having it take a straight path across the entire length of this dock. And of course, because it's PO, it's just for looks and doesn't actually function and pick up containers, but I do think it makes the whole area look a little bit more dynamic now that we have our own little Sisyphus reach stacker rolling around the dock. The very last bit of the dock here is going to be dedicated to the general cargo yard. So basically anything that doesn't need to be lifted by the heavy lift cranes or shoved into a container is going to be loaded and unloaded here. I imagine that this part of the dock is going to be the least used, especially because the terminal now has the additional expansion dock, which we built last episode, and that's going to more or less facilitate moving the same kind of cargo. So this area isn't going to be as busy or as detailed as the others, but I think that's going to add a nice little bit of balance to the overall look of the terminal. This is mostly going to consist of an open yard for staging and storing stuff, but I did want to include a warehouse for anything that might need to be stored indoors before being shipped off, and there's also a little shed on the side which is going to be used for spawning maintenance vehicles. There's a short rail spur which is not going to be functional, so it's just for looks. Maybe they still use it and it's just not very busy, or maybe it's just not in use anymore. To the left of the warehouse is going to be the main storage yard. I'm going to make this out of concrete, and the rest of the dock is just going to be empty space for loading and unloading ships. for functionality, the shed, which like I said is going to be a road maintenance depot, is going to get a road maintenance depot block clipped into it. The warehouse itself is a functional warehouse, which I just had set to store commercial goods. Out in the working area, I'm going to have these things lined up, getting ready to be loaded onto a ship. I don't know exactly what these things are supposed to be, and I think maybe in this case, it's better just to leave it up to the imagination. The very last area here will be a little tugboat maintenance and mooring area, I guess, which is something they seem to have in the equivalent spot in Duluth. At least I think that's what this is. Anyway, the build is pretty straightforward, just a little portable office thing, and some various clutter and storage crammed in here between the tracks and the edge of the dock. Of course, we also have the all-important tugboats. For some reason, I can't seem to change their colors using the color mod integrated into Move It, so I just stuck with the 1 red boat and 2 blue boats that I got from plopping them down. I think those look good enough. So there is actually one more thing, and it's this kind of bare-looking area here. I thought it was a bit too empty, even though I, did try to have some more negative space here. So I'm going to add a couple things, including a small additional container storage area. And then there's also going to be this strip of grass at the edge of the dock. Once again, taken from the inspiration. It's a small detail, but I think breaking up the asphalt like this just makes everything feel a little bit more imperfect and realistic. So that is the first part of the public terminal build done. I hope that you enjoyed the video, and I can't wait to see you on the next one. Thank you so much to my channel members, with a special shout out to my $5 tier members, New, Peter J, and Victor Sellen. And thank you for watching.